Okay, so here we are in the Phrase Orchestrator editor view. We're looking at a workflow, if I zoom out, that I've created already to show you one of the use cases that you can create now that we have QPS and segment level manipulation. So let's actually have a look at that. So we start with our trigger when a job is completed in the machine translation workflow step. Whenever that event passes, this workflow will then trigger. I've been a bit simple with it. I just want to look at a particular test project that I have that matches Danielle's test project. We'll then move forward to a technical step which fetches all the access tokens, which you then use to authenticate all of these other actions we have in the workflow. Secondly, there's another step, configuration values. If you want to add in some variables to use later in the workflow, for example, you can see here template UID, which we would use for the email templates later on, which I will show you. But to actually get started into the meat of the workflow, we've got two kind of preparatory steps here that I'm going to show you. The first one is running QA, and then the second is actually grabbing the QPS data. So we'll take both these values to then decide which segments to lock and confirm for review later in the workflow. Starting with run quality assurance, this will, for example, flag up terminology, errors, and then once that's been performed, we'll then grab those segments that do meet those QA warnings, which we'll then use later in the workflow, combined with the QPS branch that you see here. Speaking of the QPS branch, in order to grab the QPS score from the pre-translated file, you would need to start with a download MXLIFF file action. This is basically the back-end file where the translations are performed. In our cat tool, it has the segments, the source, which contains the source and target translation data. So we'll download that, and then we'll convert it to JSON format so we can handle it in Orchestrator. Moving forward, we'll then list all of the segments to then parse that segment data. When we're parsing the segment data, we're grabbing the information that we need. So this is a JQ that's already prepared for you. It would grab the ID, the origin, whether it's MT, translation memory, non-translatable, and then even the segment length if you wanted to use that for any decision criteria and perhaps another workflow, which is pretty cool. The next step is when we start to get into the actual decision criteria. So in this one, using another transform JSON with JQ action, we're actually going to apply the filtering based on QPS. So we'll have a look at that. If you're not super familiar with JQ, I'll just go over it really generically. But for any segments that are machine translated and have a score of above 70%, then we're choosing those segments. If there's any segments that have an origin of non-translatable and the score is above 99%, then we're grabbing those. Likewise, for translation memory segment matches and the score is above 99%, we're grabbing those and their segment IDs. So yeah, moving forward, we then need to actually create a list of segments to lock. We'll take the information, what we just discussed for the QPS, where we know which segments are above a certain score, and then we know which segments don't have any QA warnings. We then want to get that list together, so we're combining that to know which segments to then lock. So we're pushing that list of segments that we wish to lock back into the original MXLIFF file, but we need to, of course, first say which segments in that list that we actually want, what we want to do with them. In this case, we know we want to lock them, so that's been chosen. We want to confirm them for translation memory, and that's what's been chosen here. But if for other use cases you wanted to say, hey, keep unlocking status, or maybe you wanted to unlock them for whatever reason, again, for another use case, you can do so with this action. It's a custom action, so it actually behaves a little bit differently to other actions you have in Orchestrator, but it's a pretty powerful thing where you can be really specific about what to do with segments, particularly for locking if you don't want certain segments based on whatever criteria to be looked at by a human, or edited by a human rather. You can choose lock segments here. Next step seems pretty obvious. You need to then upload that MXLIFF file back using this action here. So it takes that MXLIFF file and uploads it, which is great. So we've pretty much done all the operational activities in this workflow where you say, hey, I want these segments to be locked based on this criteria. But once you've locked them, we want to obviously still take those that are unlocked for the reviewers to then perform their post additions on. So those are the next steps here. A couple of prerequisite steps which I won't go into in too much detail. Moving on, we then want to have a look at the number of segments that are left, and then we want to compare the locked versus unlocked word count. Taking that information, if there are no unlocked words, then we mark the job as completed, as you can see here. But if there are some unlocked segments, then of course we want a linguist or a reviewer to actually have a look over that content and make any edits, because based on the decision criteria before, the quality is a bit low. So how do we do that? So if there are still some unlocked segments, then we'll take these last 3 steps here on the right side of the branch, where we'll assign providers from the template UID being stored in the configuration variables action, which I showed you much earlier in the workflow. And then lastly, we'll then notify them to let them know there's some work to review. That reviewer will then see the job composed of all the segments that we saw initially translated, all of them, the locked, the unlocked. But for those that are locked, they can't edit them. They will only pay attention to the unlocked segments. But the fact that they can still see the locked segments mean that we still maintain context. But the best thing I feel like I can do is actually show you what this looks like in the file. So I had already triggered this workflow, and that means that it's executed across this document case study. We'll then take a look at it here in our cat tool, and yeah, you can see it happening already. So look at these segments here. This fourth one, it's got a QPS score of 76, it's locked. It's got this one here, QPS score also of 76, it's locked and confirmed. 74, locked. 76, locked. And like I mentioned, the reviewer will only perform additions over the unlocked segments, but will still maintain context of the entire document, which is always important for quality purposes.